to be fair, there are a lot of problems with organic farming. Just any kind of industrial farming is going to have environmental impacts. And I think one of the things that we need to do as a society, as humans, is understand that when we um, get a higher yield because we organize our efforts, there is a there's like an offset somewhere. So there's something that we have to make sure that we are addressing on the other end in terms of like the pollution, the use of the land, the degradation, that we need to look at a more holistic picture in how we are producing our food. So potential problems that are attached to organic farming, because organic is not perfect, leaching nitrates into the groundwater because a lot of manure is used instead of synthetic fertilizers. And so the manure has a lot more nitrates instead of the ammonia and things that are coming from synthetic fertilizers. But nitrates are bad and they're going into the ground if they're being over fertilized in those areas. Large scale composting does generate a lot of methane. And then some organic farmers will resort to plowing because they're not going to use pesticides. They're not using herbicides to take care of weeds. So they'll plow rows. Well, that can lead to soil erosion and loss of soil nutrients in and of itself. So it's not a perfect answer, but we still need to continue to solve these problems. So we look at some pros and cons for each of these different capacities. We had talked about crops. We kind of dealt with the pros and cons of crops. Now we're dealing with the pros and cons of meat production. How the pro obviously increased meat supply, reducing overgrazing, and then it's kept food prices down. So when you have what I showed you, that picture of feedlots, and you've got a lot of cattle in that small space, the cost of producing that food does come down. The cons are it uses a lot of water. You have to irrigate a lot of grain crops in order to feed those animals, and then livestock waste pollute waterways, obviously, and it just uses a large amount of energy in general. Um, so you can see that's kind of put in a nice little. This is a reminder. Alexa, stop. We'll put that in a nice little graphic for you. Aquaculture, there are hidden issues with aquaculture that are just kind of coming to light. Several environmental problems are produced by holding fish in small contained areas. They're caught to use, if they're caught to use to feed the fish on the farms, that can contribute to the depletion of wild fish in and of itself. And it's kind of this false sense of security, like, oh, I'm dealing with fish farmed fish. And so I'm not supporting an industry that's overfishing fisheries. However, what isn't told to you is that some of those fish that you're eating do require, they're carnivorous. And so they do require like other fish be caught and brought in. And then there's environmental toxins that can be introduced, and there's pesticides and antibiotics that are used on fish farms. And because it's still a new industry, they kind of have this like free open reign where the public hasn't learned about the dark side of it. And so there isn't as much regulation yet. Also, because waters are not regulated in the same way that land within a country is regulated. But this can destroy or degrade um, kelp forests and mangrove forests. So places that are really delicate coastal ecologies can actually be degraded very quickly by aquaculture. So this, if you've ever driven down the coast beyond California, but mostly like in Mexico, you see these aquaculture tanks, and so there's a lot of good things that have come out of this, but a lot of disadvantages that have come to light, especially like within the last 10 years. So how can we protect crops from pests in a way that is sustainable? How can we produce crop yields that are going to sustain our society? One of the things that is promising is that we can sharply cut pesticide use if we are to kind of like introduce new techniques, cultivation techniques, biological pest control, small amounts of selected chemical pesticides that may be part of what we call an integrated pest management system. Obviously, like, we don't want to introduce chemicals. Like in the 1950s, they were all about that. And we've seen the results of the overuse of DDT. I know we just talked about that last week. So pests do interfere with human welfare. They are natural enemies. There are natural enemies, though, that can control pest populations, but oftentimes our industrial methods for food production kind of take some of those natural controls and remove those natural controls, so then all of a sudden we've got a pest problem. Predators, parasites, disease organisms, those all will keep populations in check in natural ecosystems. That's a free ecosystem service, but when we introduce monoculture and we industrialize food production, we kind of take out that natural limit. So synthetic pesticides do help control pests. This is chemicals that are used to kill or control pests. These would be insecticides, those go after insects, herbicides, which kill weeds, basically, fungicides, which take care of fungus that can, like molds and mildews and things that can ruin crops, and rodenticides. So, rodenticides obviously kill rodents. Biopesticides, in contrast to synthetic pesticides, would be things that would be naturally produced by plants that can ward off insects and herbivores. And this will come up later, but it's kind of just to show you that there is another option and to show you what this term means. So put it there, introduce it, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. First generation pesticides were borrowed from plants. Second generation pesticides were produced in the lab. Example of that would be DDT. And then broad spectrum agents, which can be toxic to beneficial species, are things that are applied that will take care of like everything. So these are just some terms to know. And then narrow spectrum agents will be like targeting certain types of pests. Like, oh, this really just works on grubs. This works on leaf borers or things like that. And then persistence for each of these things varies. So how long they are actually effective against a pest is a variable that we have to be aware of. And these are like terms that you definitely need to be aware of in order to understand pesticides and the use of pesticides. Some of the benefits of synthetic pesticides: human lives saved. So we looked at that with malaria and DDT. Increased food supply, reduction of food losses. It can help control erosion and build soil fertility by being able to avoid plowing, which takes care of weeds. Helps farmers to reduce the costs. Newer pest control methods are safer and are more effective, and we are constantly looking at how long do these chemicals stay in the environment? How long do they stay in biota? Like what are the effects? So there's a huge shift in our society that has made it more beneficial, but it's not necessarily perfect either. So some problems still: accelerated development of genetic resistance within pests. So we're actually like moving the hand of evolution. These pests develop resistance very quickly because their lifespans are short and their genetic turnover is pretty quick. It's expensive for farmers. Some insecticides will kill natural predators or parasites that are actually helping control the pests. And so then you have a bigger pest problem. They can cause environmental pollution. They can cause harm to wildlife, especially birds. And some are human health hazards. So there are a lot of trade-offs with using synthetic pesticides. So you can see the application of synthetic pesticide here. Really what it's showing you is like, okay, first application, it was effective, but there were some that survived, and the one that survived now has reproduced. And so now when you go back and you use that same pesticide, you are going to have a less effective return. And so there are a lot more pests in the picture E that survived that particular pesticide. So basically, we've just pushed the hand of natural selection, and the use of the pesticide has selected for the resistant strain of that particular pest. So what can you do as somebody in society? Reducing exposure to pesticides means like you grow some of your own food using organic methods, buy certified organic foods, wash and scrub all fruits and vegetables, because everything can even have residues. Eat less meat or no meat, or certified organic produced meat, or kind of make it a special thing. Eating lower on the food chain does reduce the impacts or the needs for synthetic pesticides in overall society. Before cooking, trim the fat, because fat actually holds on to organic synthetics, and that like your body will store these organics in your fats. And so if you're eating a lot of fatty food that the fats come from the meat itself and it's not organic, that's where those pesticides and things are going to reside. Pesticide use has not consistently reduced in the United States. Actually, it's kind of gone up. So from 1942 to 1997, crop losses from insects increased from 7 to 13%, even though the increase of pesticide use was going up. In 2014, there was a study that said that no increase in soybean crop yields for crops that were treated with 3 conventional neonicotinoids. They found that really using more pesticides did not increase the crop. And so obviously the pesticide industry is going to dispute those findings because they're trying, to keep their product on the market. But there really isn't a lot of science that supports the use of pesticides. Laws and treaties can help protect us from harmful insects. I mean, the harmful effects of pesticides. So, this is where policy comes into play. The EPA, the USDA, the FDA, they are all the federal agencies so the Environmental Protection Agency, the US Department of Drug Administration, and the Food and Drug Administration. Um, so, this is where you're going to have regulations, but also know that the companies that are producing pesticides and synthetic fertilizers are also trying to inform these law making agencies. So federal laws will regulate, but there has to be science, clear science, in order to really combat companies promoting the use and kind of pushing that. The US exports many banned pesticides. So we make them and we cannot use them, but we actually sell them to other countries to use. And one thing to know is that when you fumigate or you take an airplane and like you've got these large scale introductions of pesticides and these synthetic chemicals into the air, those can be transmitted into the atmosphere. And so it's not that far away for um and then oftentimes we're buying that produce back here. We can't use it here in the United States. We wouldn't use it to produce produce. However, it can be exported, used in another country, and then that produce is bought back here. So that's definitely a loophole that is in use. There are alternatives to synthetic pesticides: biological controls, ecological controls, and cultivation controls. Biological controls would actually be natural predators or parasites that are used. So, like, by example, when you grow a lot of what are called crucifers, so things that cabbage, broccoli, kale, those kinds of foods, they're highly susceptible to aphids. Well, a natural predator of an aphid is a ladybug. So when I grow those in my garden, I buy ladybugs and I release the ladybugs into my garden to help to keep the aphid population down. Ecological controls would be plant diversity that would provide habitats for the predators of the pest species. So, like, you're basically engineering a more balanced ecosystem that would give a place for the predators of those particular pests to live. And then cultivation controls is where you just, like, what crop are you actually cultivating, adjust planting times, really scientifically look at rotating or intercropping or things where that will help. There's, like, marigolds and garlic and things that can offset some pests. um, Integrated pest management is more of like the large scale um, management of pests that happens in the industrial side of things. So it's a program where each crop and its pests are evaluated as part of an ecosystem, and then they try to just do the kind of control that is needed. Disadvantages is it requires some serious knowledge, scientific expert knowledge on what you see as a pattern repeating, as far as like what pests are, or what crops are susceptible to what pests, and how to really offset that. So that it's taken some time to build industry knowledge. Methods are applied in one area and they might not really work or apply in another area. And at first, the cost can be really high because this is like, it takes a lot of thinking and there's a lot of brain power that goes behind integrated pest management.